Namaste everyone. I'm Roshan Karyappa. Welcome to the Bharat Varta podcast. We're living in truly historic times. The nation is bracing itself for August 5th when the Bhumi Puja for the construction of the Grand Ram Mandir will commence at the Ram Janmabhoomi in Ayodhya. And in today's episode, we have Vivek Khaitan and Rohit Jayaraman here to discuss its history and broader significance. So, welcome to the podcast, Rohit and Vivek. Great to have you guys here.
Thanks, Gary.
Thanks a lot, Kerry.
So, we have very interesting backgrounds, as you can see, right? And we'll start with some opening comments. Vivek, as someone who has studied history in college, did you think that this day would come? And what do you think as the key inflection point in this whole time leading up to this?
Yes, as someone who had studied history, one was sort of made to feel guilty all the time that somebody asking for restoration of a temple was a revisionist, a revivalist, and not someone who is in tune with the secular traditions of India. So it was a kind of a lonely journey for a lot of people through the 90s as to why this temple is important. And in many ways, this turned out to be one of the movements which led to the rise of the Narendra Modi phenomenon that we see today. Swapan Das Gupta in the 90s commented once when this movement had sort of petered out and it looked like that it is going nowhere, that Ram Mandir movement was a historical turning point when history refused to turn. It seems that history actually takes longer arc and it turns not in years or even decades, but multiple decades. And 30 years down the line, we are actually seeing the culmination of that process where this temple is actually getting built.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I have similar feelings about it. This whole revisionist sort of a tint to the whole movement, right? And also the apologia in some sense, right? Rohit, same question to you. Did you know that this would become an eventuality, and any particular inflection point that you can think of?
Thanks, Gary, for that question. So I think from a personal perspective, honestly, if you ask me over the last 15, 20 years, if you would ask me whether the Ram Mandir would actually be, built or be anywhere close to being built, I would have been very pessimistic. I think as Vivek just quoted Swapan Das Gupta, this really seemed like something that seemed inevitable, but then suddenly, petered out, especially in the 90s and the 2000s. And I think what broadly happened there was at a very basic level, while of course the Ram Mandir is a very religious thing for most Hindus, and at its core, it's a religious movement. At the end of the day, building the temple itself is a political act, and to that extent, I think the fortunes of the temple, so as to speak, have ebbed and flowed with the way Indian politics has ebbed and flown, especially since independence. Because pre-independence, obviously, what was happening was slightly different, and how the British looked upon it is not really something we need to get into today. But this ebb and flow of political fortunes, because Ram Mandir is one of those totemic issues where you know in our last, at least in the last episode I participated in on the Congress, where we had sort of, described it as a Big Ten party and all of that. One thing that the Congress was very clear on was it was not interested in the Ram Mandir for the longest period of time, right? And till Rajiv Gandhi opened the locks in the 80s, the Congress had stayed away from it. And while, of course, there was a Congress Prime Minister who was in charge when the masjid was actually demolished, that is sort of different from saying that the party ever really wanted it to be built. And to that extent, at least when Sonia Gandhi and then later Rahul Gandhi took over the party, it was very clear that the Congress didn't want it. And the BJP and the Congress here is not an outlier, right? As in, you could say that almost every political party in India probably didn't want it, except the BJP and the Shiv Sena, which of course, interestingly, today doesn't want it, while having wanted it when nobody else wanted it. It's a different story.
Right.
And that's where I think the BJP in the 90s really didn't have the power to do anything about it. It got into a large coalition and it sort of focused on other things, and rightfully so, considering the context of that time. Then, when the Congress came into power, there was a 10-year period of UPA where obviously there was no real, no one was really seriously contemplating the mandir being built. And that's where I think what Vivek again said about Narendra Modi that merits a mention here, that even 6 years ago, I don't think people really understood how much political change and revolution politically that Narendra Modi would bring to India. And the kind of political capital he has built, and his willingness to spend that political capital on issues that are close to his heart at a very basic level, and of course to the party. When probably even if he hadn't done it, yeah, people would have cribbed, but the people would have moved on because. And that's where I think this probably comes in, that at some point this is a political project of the BJP, the larger Sangh Parivar, and of course Mr. Modi as a person. That's why it's probably come into focus suddenly again.
Right.
That's where I would sort of place it.
Right. A couple of things I want to pick up on from what you mentioned. One is the fact that even Narendra Modi ji coming to power in 2014 did not mean that the Ram Mandir would happen, right? It's taken 6 years in the making, and for many of us, I mean, I guess we had resigned it to fate, right? Whenever fate willed for it to happen, right? And interestingly, Subramanian Swamy mentioned, I think yesterday or day before, I don't know. He says that there are 3 people who we should be thankful for this case. One being Rajiv Gandhi, second being Ashok Singhal-ji, and then third, I think he said P.V. Narasimha Rao, right? So he didn't count Modi-ji for obvious reasons, right? So Vivek, let's just step back a little bit, and much of this has happened because of the wonderful work that the ASI, the Archaeological Society of India, has done. And people like Professor B.B. Lal, Dr. K.K. Mohammed, and Professor Meenakshi Jain. Now, you've studied their work in a lot of depth. So, can you help us understand their contribution?
Yes. You see, it's actually interesting as to, this entire legal case, supposedly a property case, also sort of started, bringing in flavor of history and archaeology into it. But the interesting part is that history and archaeology were actually never in dispute till 1989. It was very clear from the beginning, through the historical and archaeological records dating back to 1,000 years, that there was a Ram temple on that place, that it was a Ram Janmabhoomi, always decorated at least since 11th century with a large temple, which got demolished in the 16th century by Babur's general Mir Baqi. It became controversial only because somehow the secularist politics of India became so toxic that even facts which were never under dispute were disputed, and the standards of evidence which were sought to be established was of an order which is unreasonable. It's to the credit of the scholars on, let's say, the Hindu side, who have marshaled evidence to the extent that it became impossible for anyone to ignore that evidence. And I'll take you through the history of Ayodhya before actually talking about what some of these scholars, the names that you mentioned, and some of the others actually achieved in last 20, 30 years, in fact. You see, the history of Ayodhya is it's at least 2,000-year-old history, recorded history, which is known. But I'll take you from about for last 1,000 years. You see, the first invasions, so to say, on Ayodhya actually started with the invasion of Mahmud Ghaznavi itself. And his general Salar Masood actually reached Ayodhya in 1030-31 and was actually defeated by the current flavor of the season, Raja Suhel Dev. He actually marshaled the troops and sort of created the coalition which pushed back this invasion at that time. So that was actually the first instance where a coalition was established to save Ayodhya from the impending destruction. It so happens that it didn't last very long. I mean, that pushback was something which lasted in Indian history for about 150 years before Muhammad Ghori again around 1190s came and sort of started his trail of destruction. So Ayodhya, went into the Sultanate rule, the Muslim rule in the 1200s under the rule of Iltutmish itself, and it has remained since under one or the other Muslim rule. First, it was the Delhi Sultanate, then there was these Jaunpur Sharki kingdoms. Then obviously the Lodhis came in and they ruled this place. And then the period of Mughal start, and it has actually for the entire 600 years it remained under Muslim rule. So a lot of fundamental changes occurred, but Hindus kept alive the memory of Ram Janmasthan throughout. The temple actually existed for a long period even under Muslim rule and got demolished only in the 16th century. That's sort of the historical background. After the demolition of the temple, the local Hindus as well as Hindus from other parts of India kept on making pilgrimages to the place and kept the memory alive. So, I mean, a few names today we know, but actually there is a long line of devotees through the last 500 years who, through the sheer willpower of making pilgrimage to that place under most adverse circumstances, kept the memory alive, which has allowed present generation to actually mount a challenge and win the case finally. Now, there are historical foreign sources as well, foreign like Tiffin Halar, who visited this place and has recorded the history of dispute as to how this place was always revered as Ram Janmasthan, etc. So I'll not go into some of those boring details today. Since 1949, this actually became a legal case. Once India became independent, this became a legal case because the local people actually petitioned the local administration to allow them to construct a grand temple. And with Nehru being in power, and he was given the situation at that point of time, was against what he considered to be Hindu revivalism. And as part of that idea, he refused to actually concede that place, and it got locked in the 1950s itself, which again got opened in 1986, and then sort of the entire debate began. Now, between 1950 and 1986, when the lock was actually opened, there never was any dispute whether Ram was born there, whether a temple existed there or not. Such issues never came up before 1986. It's only after this turn of politics around 1986 with the Shah Bano judgment and Muslim appeasement that started, and some of the historians which were sort of nurtured throughout the 30-40 years of independence and had become very powerful, who actually thought that they would be able to mount challenge on the facts itself and obscure the facts so much that they would be able to keep the issue alive by making it disputed. I'll take you through the details of as to how some of these scholars as to how they mounted this challenge, what was the environment in which this entire thing was done, because there was a formal process of establishing the veracity of the facts which was instituted by Government of India, starting with Rajiv Gandhi itself, and that went on till about when P.V. Narasimha Rao. So between 1988 to 92, before the actual demolition happened, there was a 4-year period in which the evidence back and forth kept on happening under multiple forums, but somehow the other party actually kept talking over the forum, trying to establish themselves as the neutral party rather than getting into the debate with the party which was sponsored by VHP in that debate. So I'll take you through that in the next segment.
Sure. So Rohit, the Ram Mandir movement, as Vivek briefly touched upon it as well, gained momentum post-independence, especially in 1949 when Sri Abhiram Das instituted an idol of Ram Lalla in the place, right? Can you help us understand in a little more depth some of the key political movements post-independence that could be sort of a precursor for the current times?
Sure, Gary. So I think what's happened post-independence, and a lot of scholars have sort of, or at least commentators, a better term, probably would have sort of classified this into several phases, right? In the sense that the first phase was basically what you just mentioned about the 1949 installation of idols. Then the second phase basically started with the uh, opening of the locks by Rajiv Gandhi and ended probably with the demolition of the masjid itself. And the third phase, you could say, because it's not really a phase, it's just been a series of incidents and, of course, a court judgment that probably started after the demolition of the masjid, which is led to the building of the temple. So here, I think the first thing is if you look at, and I'm quoting a lot of secular scholars here. First aspect of it started in 1949, and we all know about that. The key players then were primarily Mr. K.K. Nair, right, who was then the DM of Ayodhya. And he was the person who sort of took on the center and the state government and sort of refused to get the remove the idols that had been installed inside the premises. And at that time, what you can say is KK and one of Mr. Nair's key conspirators in this whole process was Mahant Digvijay Nath, who was then the Mahant of the Gorakhnath Mutt. Of course, that means that he's basically the predecessor of the current CM of UP, that is Yogi Adityanath. And I think what we can see about Man Digvijay Nath and this role of this whole thing from a political perspective is the first stance, for instance, from 1949, this as a political movement under the leadership of Mahan Digvijay Nath, who sort of at different times co-opted with Jan Sangh, with portions of Hindu Mahasabha, which had by then weakened, with local rulers, it became very important in what is known as the Trans Gagra part of UP, right? Which is basically sort of where Ayodhya is, which is sometimes called Uttar Kosla, or it's actually Kosla, right? That's the kingdom of Lord Rama historically. So you can see in early election results right up till 1967 how the Jan Sangh would keep winning in basically places that is Bahraich and Balrampur districts of UP. This is basically the Terai right on the border. Interesting thing here is that the Gorakhnath Mutt, while it is in Gorakhpur, which is slightly to the east of this, actually has a very significant influence itself there. And because it has another mutt there in what is known as Tulsipur in Balrampur district. And Atal Bihari Vajpayee, actually, the first time he got elected to the Lok Sabha in 1957 was from Balrampur. While he had stood from two other seats, I can't remember the names offhand. I think one was Agra. He lost in both the other seats, interestingly, but he was able to win from Balrampur. Both Mr. K.K. Nair and his wife, Shakuntala Nair, both won from seats in this part of the country, right? That is Bahraich, Kaisarganj. So you can see that initially also this was very much a political movement. It was very localized in 3-4 districts of UP, which were very close to Ayodhya. And then again, and this links to the larger political picture of India, right? Once Indira Gandhi took power, some of these things really petered out, especially in the 70s and right till her death. A lot of these things to stop losing priority. Man Digvijay Nath himself passed away. Mahant Avedyanath took over, and he, of course, focused on this in a lot of ways. But the national environment was focused on other things. It started with the 1971 war. Then you immediately moved on to emergency. Then after emergency was your Janta movement, and then the anti-Janta movement. Then Khalistan came. So a lot of things kept happening, and that way the Ram Mandir movement sort of lost significance. Before it was, but and this is important that it was kept alive in its home base, so as to speak, right, by people there. And then when the RSS looked at the VHP decided to revitalize itself. It saw that this was something that was very important, and that's how you can say you moved on to the second phase. And I'm not going too much into the second phase or even third phase because I think most people broadly know what happened. Rajiv Gandhi opened the locks. This was after Shah Banu. Then a bunch of like Rajiv Gandhi's personal popularity diminished. The general sense of India moving towards some of these things increased in the Indian, in the average mindset. You can even link it to something like the telecasting of Ramayana. But all of these things in the late 80s, then liberalization happened. By then, the mosque was, of course, demolished. So there was a lot of ferment. That is well documented. I'm not going too much into that. But I think some of the initial parts is where people really gloss over. And it may be good to know a bit more about them. That's why I sort of brought that up.
Right. This also became a sort of a key national movement, right? Something that all parts of the country could identify with, key national political movement as such. Do you want to talk about that in a little bit detail, Rohit?
Yeah, sure, Carrie. So that's what I was alluding to, that that's more of a well-known fact. So I wasn't going too much into that. But see, once this whole thing started in the 80s, of course, with LK Advani's Rath Yatra was the inflection point, right? Because the interesting thing about the Rath Yatra was that it went from Gujarat, and while it was stopped in Bihar, basically went all through the south, right? And one of the key criticisms that a lot of people raise about this whole movement, especially Dravidian people with the Dravidian ideology, is that Ram has nothing to do with the South, whereas like the South, and of course Dravidians have this tendency to conflate at a very basic level Tamil Nadu with the whole South, and even leaving that aside, because I mean, a lot of people know how the biggest number of Karsevaks all actually came from Karnataka and what was then undivided
Exactly.
Andhra Pradesh. And this Rath Yatra, of course, really mobilized people, because one thing we need to understand is that day you didn't really have social media or even any sort of communication. So to that extent, this, which was so freely this thing, and the gatekeepers, so as to speak, had more control over the discourse. That's where probably the Rath Yatra, I think, was, of course, the key point in this mobilization to some extent. And the VHP and the RSS, I mean, RSS especially, they've spent over 90 years now in building a grassroots network right to the depth of India. So if they want to really get some message passed and people are interested in it, it's very easy for the RSS to activate people on the ground. And I think that's where the Sangh really played its really important role. And just one last point on this whole Ram not being important in South India, which Dravidians say. I think sometimes Dravidians forget that their real big leader was actually called Ramaswamy. So it's really, really funny of them to say that Ram had no role in South India. But yeah, I guess that's what politics is.
Or as one of their favorite, I don't know, idols or whatever, right? Karunanidhi's favorite idol, Ravan. Subramaniam Swamiji claims he was born in Noida. So there are deep roots connecting the south and the north.
Let's not go too much into
Sure.
Dr. Swami's claims.
Sure. So, Vivek, of course, the most significant event in this was the demolition of the Babri Masjid by the Karsevaks in '92, right? A lot of people, I mean, especially of my generation, remember the demolition and the post-demolition riots across the country. It was definitely testing times for us, right? But let's talk about the events precipitating that, right? I mean, what led to that, and then if you can briefly touch upon that fateful day as well.
Yeah, sure. So, as Rohit related, this entire movement actually started becoming, an issue of national importance from 1986 onwards, when the locks of the gates were opened, which in turn again was precipitated by the Shah Bano judgment and the claims that the Rajiv Gandhi government was captured by the Islamic reactionary forces, and in order to dilute that image, they actually wanted to sort of do something, and that's how the locks were opened. Now the entire story actually begins from that phase only. Before that, it was more of an issue simmering under the ground, but not really something which politicians really took care of. So once Rajiv Gandhi did that, all kinds of forces were unleashed, and people. So there were people on one side who wanted to get the temple built immediately, and there were people who were simply denying the claims, the Hindu claims on the site itself. So in the closing days of Rajiv Gandhi government in 1989, he had proposed an idea that the two parties, so on the one hand, it was VHP which was spearheading the movement till that time, and on the other hand, There was, a coalition of people who styled themselves as Babri Masjid Action Committee, who were sort of opposing the Hindu claims from the other side. So Rajiv Gandhi decided, let's bring these two people together and thrash out the historical and archaeological evidence, basis which a decision will be taken by the government. Now, this was the first admission that historical and archaeological evidence is disputed and will play a part in deciding the case, which was not the case before that. It was always assumed before that the Hindu claim is sacrosanct and understood very well. Then Rajiv Gandhi government fell, VP Singh came, the entire Mandal movement was unleashed, and this sort of again, got into the background. Again, Mandal itself was unleashed because it was felt that BJP was running away with the so-called Hindu issues, and something was to be done to rein BJP in. Then BJP adopted Ram Mandir as its official, political plan, and since then it became an issue of national importance, where politicians were forced to take, positions on the issue every election from 1989 election onwards. So Advani ji's Rath Yatra sort of, raised the pitch of the entire movement to a different level. It brought consciousness about this issue. Not, it was always known very well, this issue in the North India, but perhaps in South India it was not, issue as such was not that well known. Advani ji's Rath Yatra sort of, spread the issue entire the country and made it a national issue. Then VP Singh government also fell. Chandrasekhar's government came in for 4 months. He actually advanced that, that process whereby government wanted to bring in VHP and BMSC on single platform to thrash out the historical and archaeological evidence, and basis that take a decision whether that site should be handed over to Hindus or not. Then VHP, brought in their set of historians. BMAC brought in their set of historians. So from VHP side, there was Harsh Narayan, there was SP Gupta, and there were, a couple of others who were actually, who collated the entire evidence and sort of brought about this entire evidence into picture. Now, on the other hand, so there were, historians Suraj Bhan, and there was R.S. Sharma, who was the doyen of ancient history at that point of time, who were actually marshaled in as historians by BMAC. Now, these were historians of repute. One of the side fallouts of the entire movement has been the demystifying of the Indian historical establishment. Till that point, these were very reputed historians: R.S. Sharma, Suraj Bhan, D.N. Jha, all of these people, from the BMAC side, made the case not to the VHP historians in their forum, but to the public at large through their control over media and academia, that there is no evidence which exists for a temple there. When the evidence was presented by VHP historians, they asked for 6 weeks' time in order to study the evidence. Whereas till that time, they were claiming that there is no evidence for the temple there or for the historicity of Rama on that site. So that process, it became very apparent within a month's time that that process is not going anywhere. And the political side of the entire movement was getting ahead of the this negotiation, or rather the historical evidence side of it. VHP was getting anxious, BJP was getting anxious that this looked like delaying tactics from the BMAC side instead of actually trying to, thrash out the issue in detail in an honest attempt to settle the issue. It became very apparent that the BMAC historian, instead of presenting their evidence in the meeting, actually went on to, publish a report, pompously titled "Historian's Report to the Nation," which sort of was the not their part of the evidence, but their questioning of the evidence, which was published by the VHP. And the questioning was of the kind that how can you establish that Rama was born? Is there any DNA test to establish that? Rama was born in some Middle East kind of, those kind of theories were sort of brought in. Whereas the only historical evidence which mattered was that whether there was a temple site and whether there is an continued existing belief in the place as being the birthplace of Ram. There was no other question which can be thrust out by history and archaeology, right? Nobody can prove whether Rama was born, even born or not, forget taking birth at a particular site. right? So the continued history and the continued reverence for the place is something that was the only issue that could be decided, and that was not something that was tackled by BMAC historians at all, which was again put together. I mean, VHP at that point was basically ridiculed in media as a bunch of extremists with absolutely, no predisposition towards any historical or archaeological evidence, right? Whereas the facts of the matter are exactly opposite. It was the VHP side which brought in a lot of evidence, but found that the evidence is not being considered at all, and that the government is deterring. They are not able to force their will on the teams on the both sides to thrash out the issue. And then the political movement, sort of went ahead of itself. VHP planned Kar Seva there, and then a group within the, Kar Sevaks actually, sort of either planned or on the spur of the moment did something which led to the demolition of the disputed structure there. Now, the interesting fact is that this entire process, whereby a peaceful solution was sought to be found, which was very clear, it seems, from the evidence, right from Rajiv Gandhi till PV Narasimha Rao, was that the site has to be handed over to Hindus. That process actually happened post 92 as well. Not, different parties trying to thrash it out by bringing them together, but PV Narasimha Rao government actually made a presidential reference under Article 143 to the Supreme Court of India to adjudicate on the matter. But in 1994, Supreme Court actually returned the presidential reference without giving its opinion on the matter. And that's where the entire process sort of, this entire process which started in 88 of trying to find some sort of negotiated settlement didn't go anywhere, led to the the removal or destruction of the disputed structure on 6 December 1992, and ended with Supreme Court of India declining to adjudicate on the matter when the presidential reference was made. And then 94 onwards, somehow the politics changed. The issue got so tightly identified with BJP that Congress as a party didn't want to take it up and didn't want to sort of, handle the issue in a way where dispute gets settled, because they felt that the political credit of that will go to the BJP. And so from then onwards, I mean, the sheer, one could say the sheer, the toxicity in the discourse on the Congress side of political establishment was, raised to a level where, it sort of became a BJP issue instead of becoming a national issue for them. So that's where, that's what led to the destruction. But one has to say that if the destruction perhaps wouldn't have happened, this day would not have come, because an existing structure creates its own pull in the judgment itself.
Right. You want to talk a little bit more about 6 December 1992 itself? I mean, the Kothari brothers and, things that happened on that particular day?
Yeah. So in September or, October, so this process was actually going on, and Kar Seva was announced by VHP and BJP. Supreme Court had interfered at that point, and Supreme Court had said that that set of parameters under which this Kar Seva can be, organized. But Supreme Court allowed the BJP and VHP to go ahead with it. It is not very well known that, I mean, it is actually claimed that the leaders of the movement actually were responsible for planning the destruction of the disputed structure, but that's not the case. It was actually, in many ways a groundswell, something which was perhaps planned with a very, very small group at much below the leadership level, who actually took the initiative and planned the entire thing. In fact, it is known that once the structure was coming down, L.K. Advani was so filled with remorse that he actually wanted to give a statement that he will have nothing to do with the movement, something of that sort. And he was actually dissuaded by other leaders of the movement not to give such a weak statement, filled with in a state when he was perhaps under emotional fog. So yes, LK Advani is responsible for bringing national, focus on the issue, but none of the top leaders actually were perhaps even aware that something like this was actually going to happen.
Right. So, Rohit, let's talk about the days after that event. In '92, there was a lot of unrest in the country. Describe the events and also some of the key players like PV Narasimha Rao at that time and what they did or they did not do.
Yeah, so to start with, I think the first important thing politically, there were two things, right? One was, of course, the riots that broke out. And these riots broke out in many parts of the country, but I think the most famous or rather notorious one of this is the Bombay riots, because the riots really took on a very huge flavor in Bombay for a variety of reasons, which have a lot to do with the city itself and how it was. And of course, the Bombay riots then sort of moved on into what is known as the Bombay bomb blast, and the two sort of intertwined to create a sense of communal unrest in Bombay that I mean, is probably not even over even today, right? Like Bombay, if you look at the spatial demography of the city, the religious demography, you can clearly see the after effects of what happened in those days. Of course, it was right after that for the first time ever in '95 in Maharashtra, non-Congress government was elected to power when the BJP and the Shiv Sena came to power, which was because Maharashtra was really the most typical of the Congress states of India. And a large part of that victory of the BJP and the Shiv Sena actually did come from Bombay and its surrounding areas and other similar cities in the state. So that was one very, the riots were a very big feature of this. It happened in many cities. It happened even in places like Kerala, minor riots. I know, I still remember what I was told when growing up. Even Tamil Nadu was not left untouched. And then when you move, that is one part of it. The other more real political part of it, which I think has a larger significance, some level today, is that of course of three state governments of the BJP were dismissed. Sorry, I think it was four state governments of the BJP. That is Himachal, Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, and of course Uttar Pradesh, which is quite obviously right in the line of fire. All four of them were dismissed, and that sort of I think that's where really the political momentum of the movement sort of dissipated away, because interestingly, in none of these states could the BJP actually win when the elections were held after uh, the president's rule was lifted, except in Rajasthan, where it sort of managed a coalition government. In all the other three states, the BJP really couldn't come to power, and that was sort of a clear. At least you can spin it as a rebuke of how popular the whole thing was, and that probably does make some sense in retrospect. The other part of this was around this time that the demolition of the structure. It really shook the consensus in the country, right? Because like the consensus you could say at that point was not fully attuned even to the concept of there being a negotiated settlement over this site and a temple being accommodated. That was itself probably some way off in the distance. In the middle of that, things actually changed, and you could see that the mosque itself was demolished, which was clearly an act of, you could say, like a provocation by the supporters of the temple, right, to say the least. And at least for the establishment in India, that was a deep moment of self-reflection that, some of the fundamental principles on which they had built the country from 1947 had sort of been questioned and questioned in a very violent and you could say it didn't look good, right? I mean, forget everything else. It just looked, it was uncomfortable to see. And that sort of produced a reaction at all levels, which some form or the other exists even today, which is why you can see that not many non-BJP politicians are actually, welcoming this. Like someone like Sharad Pawar, who's a senior non-BJP politician, the kind of language he has been using over the Bhumi Pujan. Of course, he has been cloaking a lot of it under the fact that there's a corona pandemic or whatever. But you can see that that's actually coming from somewhere deeper inside, that, this is not where they thought India would be in 2019. It was definitely not where they thought India would be in 1992. That gave a lot of reaction. You can see Supreme Court judgments insisting that secularism is a part of the basic structure of the constitution. You can see a general tendency to focus on ridiculing the movement. Like the entire time of the Vajpayee government, you would always see articles and opinion polls saying that people actually are not interested in the Ram Mandir, and it came from magazines and newspapers of all types. So basically, it all boils down to that old law, right? If there's an action, there's a reaction, and that's probably what happened. And at least I think the pro Mandir side sort of became strong enough to overcome that reaction only after the election of Prime Minister Modi, and I would say even being more this thing that even after his re-election, because that's when things really, it became more a question of being purely defensive about it for people who were against the Mandir. The fact that they could, because even in 2-3 years back, there were people who were very seriously contemplating the idea of rebuilding the masjid, which is today obviously not this thing, and a lot of that is tied to how politics changed in India.
Yeah, so Vivek, Rohit just mentioned, right, that scene of the Babri Masjid coming down, it's often, shown as a blot on India's proud secularism and so on and so forth, right, our integral cultural movement and so on. The people that were associated with this as well, like Ashok Singhal ji and the Vishwa Hindu Parishad and so on, do you want to talk about their role as well? I mean, how they saw it as a cultural movement, which eventually had to become a political movement in order to kind of achieve its aims?
Yeah. So as Rohit had related earlier, that Mahant Digvijay Nath ji, sort of started the movement in the post-independence period for restoration of the temple at the site. His successor Mahant Avaidya Nath ji actually, sort of sounded out VHP and Ashok Singhal ji to take up this issue and try and win the place or for construction of a temple there. This entire movement before L.K. Advani's Rath Yatra was actually spearheaded by VHP completely. So they used to bring together people of different denominations, saints of different denominations in what they called the Dharma Sansad, and used to pass resolutions and give representations to the government and try and create localized movement of yatras and car sevas at various places, of collecting material for construction of the temple, etc. It became a movement only after LK, a national issue of national importance and a political issue, only with L.K. Advani's Rath Yatra around the country. The demolition is, of course, an issue which sort of became an ogre internationally, and there are hundreds of books written, hundreds of features done on the issue, to the complete exclusion of what actually led to it. And one cannot discount the fact that this was a site which was always revered by Hindus, has a history of struggle of Hindus over 20 generations, right from the time of demolitions. And the pro-Mandir party waged a legal struggle in post-independence India. But that struggle sort of went nowhere. A negotiated settlement, a compromise, an attempt at that, right from Rajiv Gandhi till P.V. Narasimha Rao, went nowhere. And it became such a big issue at that point that, and emotions were running so high, and it got identified with assertion of Hindu pride in the late 80s and early 90s, that this entire halting of any kind of settlement was something that was not taken well by a lot of people in India. and that in many ways led to the ultimate destruction of the site. Well, in an ideal world, you would want any such issue to be settled peacefully, which actually it actually happened. In many ways, one can say that the destruction of the disputed structure delayed the entire process of negotiated settlement, because negotiated settlement kind of became impossible. But one will also have to see that one of the parties needed to sort of come to the settlement was always intransigent, whether it was the historians earlier, the Babri Masjid Action Committee, or the All India Muslim Personal Law Board. All of these parties kept on insisting, whether it was Sayyid Sahabuddin at that point, that there is no compromise possible and that the structure has to be put back in place. So as an event in itself, one would never want to see something like that to happen, that an act of provocation or vandalism sort of happens. But without that, perhaps needle would not have moved either. So I mean, there's no possibility of any clear-cut condemnation or any clear-cut exhilaration on that point. So in the entire period, perhaps the destruction itself was one of the things which was important to see the 5th August in the making of the 5th August, essentially.
Right. Rohit, the Ayodhya judgment itself, right, was a separate thing by itself, 20 years in the making, and there were lots of ups and downs, the question of faith versus property, and what kind of precedence it sets for judgments to come. Do you want to look at it from a legal aspect and help us understand a bit more on that?
Sure, Gary. So I think the judgment of the Supreme Court, right, that was primarily in response to an appeal that was filed against a judgment of the Allahabad High Court, which I think came out in 2010, where what the Allahabad High Court had done was something. It was probably emblematic of how things worked in India around the time of that decade, right? Since that it tried to do a compromise and give 1/3 of the land to Hindus, to build a temple, 1/3 of the land to the Muslims, and 1/3 of the land to the Nirmohi Akhada. Nirmohi Akhada's role in this whole judgment is, in this whole legal battle is pretty interesting, and recommend all of you to, all the listeners also, to sort of read the judgment to understand more on what was the Nirmohi Akhada trying to prove and what its arguments were. Being that, I said, this was probably some sort of a divide between this division of land, then which immediately, and what one needs to remember is at that time this actually caused a lot of outrage, that the Allahabad High Court was sort of giving 1/3 of the land to Hindus, and like the dominant intellectual opinion of the time was in a lot of opposition to the Allahabad High Court judgment for actually being pro-Hindu. Then when you went up to the Supreme Court, it stayed there for a long time. Different chief justices, and this probably started with Justice Deepak Mishra, sort of wanted to end this case and give a judgment. Justice Deepak Mishra was sort of stymied in his approach by a large number of people. And some of you might remember the kind of things that happened during the tenure of Deepak Mishra as Chief Justice, where there was first this whole judges' press conference, then there was even an impeachment motion that was to be moved against that was, I think, either moved or attempted to be moved against Justice Mishra. All of that, and Kapil Sibal sort of was very open that he wanted this hearing and judgment to be postponed after the 2019 verdict. That, I think, sort of links to what Vivek was saying a bit shortly back about how the Congress understood that politically, at least at some point, this issue had started to belong to the BJP. So there's very little political upside for the Congress in ever really building a mandir. And of course, in today's context, the Congress actually has a lot to lose because its support base nowadays disproportionately consists of Muslims. So, and on an issue uh, which is very emotional for both sides, it had to sort of cut its losses and do that, and that's what I think settlement to be done. But then Justice Ranjan Gogoi was very clear once, I think at least, and definitely after the results of Lok Sabha 2019, he will give this judgment before he retires, and that's where I think a large part of the push to it came, because the judgment, once a court, because a large part of this sort of was on delay, right? And if you look at the what Vivek was also saying, this whole attempt of people who didn't want a mandir to be built was basically delay. And whether that was right or wrong, it did make strategic sense for them because there's only so much, and because the BJP also at some point said that it will only build the mandir if it got a legal approval. So that's where all of this ended up, and the judgment itself is a bit interesting because it goes into all sorts of places for what is essentially a property dispute, right? And that I think ends in where a lot of BJP leaders like say Uma Bharti used to say in the 90s, how can this ever be decided by a court? And I think that's where the irony is, that it was finally decided by a court, but if you look at the judgment, you realize that yeah, it was a court behaving as something else, because it was like a normal property dispute would not be, like, to start with, it would not have such a long history, but it would not really be, the arguments would be different, the considerations that the judges wrote itself would be different. That's why this whole thing became a mismatch, and I think this probably relates more to the role that Supreme Court has in Indian society, where maybe because we are still probably a relatively poor country, people look at the Supreme Court more as some sort of, old wise men sitting, and in this case they were all men sitting and giving a good judgment, taking all, like your 5 guys under a tree type of thing, right? In the sense that society gives Supreme Court that legitimacy, and that's what the Supreme Court used here. And that is what everyone who uses the judgment one way or the other to, because that's where the people who support the mandir are coming from, and people who oppose it also say that that's not what the Supreme Court is supposed to do. Like, why is the Supreme Court going into all of this while deciding what's at basically a property dispute, where the party that had possession actually lost it due to a violent act? So is the judiciary really supposed to look at it like that? And that's where all of this again comes into a circle, right? Like, should this ever have gone to the court? Probably not. Now that it went to the court did what the politicians maybe could have done, is one argument. That's why I think it's all interesting and reflective of where broader India is today.
Right. So Vivek, what's the larger significance of this? Do you see a similar movement happening for restoration of Kashi and Mathura as well?
Yeah, see, before I actually, talk about Kashi and Mathura, the larger significance is that it closes a loop in a very nice way, which is 30-year-old at least, which, let's say, started with, the unlocking of locks in 1986 and culminating with the judgment of 2019. Now, when the judgment came, there were, talks about large-scale riots happening around the country. And even though security arrangements and everything were made, it became quite clear that judgment has been taken well around the country. And that's largely perhaps due to the fact that the assertion of Hindu pride is no longer a political hot potato, and it's something which is embraced not just by BJP, but by the larger political establishment. I mean, leave aside, Congress for the moment, but nobody wants to be, sort of be completely in opposition to that. Right. So whether this actually lead to, larger Hindu assertions of pride culminating in some ways with the restoration of temple at Kashi and Mathura, well, this has been concluded on a legal basis, right? A movement was mounted, a negotiated settlement was sought to be done. It didn't happen. which led to an extraordinary event in 1992, and then 27 years later led to the judgment. Whether something will follow that kind of a template, nobody knows. As part of the negotiated settlement itself, there was a Places of Worship Act enacted in 1991.
Right. Sorry, just wanted to add there. Places like Kashi Vishwanath, for example, if you were to look at it as a case of a property and that being vandalized, right? Doesn't it have even more evidence to that effect?
Exactly. So the historical challenge to the simple fact in the case of Ram Janmabhoomi was mounted on the simple fact that when this event, actually the destruction took place in 1528, the Babur's memoir of that time is missing, of about 2 months or 2 year period is missing, and because there is no exact contemporary evidence for that, this entire challenge was mounted. Now, if you look at in the case of Kashi Vishwanath or Mathura, I mean, there are Aurangzeb's court chronicles which indisputably establish the act of destruction. So, if evidence were to lead, then there is absolutely no doubt even greater evidence available than it is in the case of Ram Janmabhoomi, even without going through the entire process of archaeological excavation and establishing the historicity of the site. So that's something which is established by Aurangzeb's chronicles itself. But as I said, there was a Places of Worship Act passed in 1991, which precludes any challenge to restoration. So anything, whatever existed in 1947 is sort of frozen in time. But then the question is whether a rising Hindu consciousness, a rising civilizational consciousness in India will allow those kind of facts to remain. Whether today India is a economy of where there's about $2,000 per capita economy, right? When it moves, let's say a decade down the line to $6,000 to $7,000 per capita economy, whether a prosperous society would allow the continuation of the historical humiliation that Hindus faced, or the Indian civilization faced at the hands of invaders, is something which is an open question. I believe that whereas the path of mounting a legal challenge to Kashi and Mathura is closed by that act act itself is under challenge now, I am hearing from some of the quarters. And be as it may, whatever may be the laws, I think 10 years down the line, 15 years down the line, nobody can say that these kind of laws will exist. Whether the question of Kashi and Mathura and many such other sites get settled in an amicable way is an open question, or whether we will see a larger struggle which may sometimes lapse into not so civilized ways of struggle either, is something which is always an open question. But I am hopeful that a rising consciousness, rising prosperity will lead, we will have to face at some stage the challenge of history and come to some sort of settlement as to how to tackle these very, very painful chapters of the past.
Right. So Rohit, there are a section of people who believe that let's focus on GDP growth, and you had this one famous journalist suggest that we can build a hospital on that site instead, right? So why fight for a temple as such? There are going to be these kind of arguments where these cultural matters are sort of pushed to secondary or tertiary priority as such, right? What do you think people will remember 50, 100 years from now about this? And why do you think it's necessary for us to prioritize these things like the Ram Janmabhoomi?
I think, Carrie, I'm not able to, I wouldn't be so sure about how people would actually remember. See, I think things done 50, 100 years later, right? The sense that people's conception of what happens is linked sort of both to where they were at that point of time and where they are, of course, at the time the judgment is being done. Like something like the American Revolution is now being questioned by a lot of Americans, which was not even thinkable, say, 10 years ago. Forget 50 years ago. Like even 10 years ago, you would be very surprised to know that people who are taken seriously actually question George Washington's greatness. So the point really, the Ram Janmabhoomi, I think, is the conception of what India was in 1947. The people who sort of framed the country's constitution and put it on, governed it in its initial years, their conception of what India was in some ways very different from what India actually was. And it is this dichotomy that has uh, been fought over the last 50, 70 or so years. And it's a very interesting thing that, right now, just a week back, something similar happened in Istanbul, right, with the Hagia Sophia. And Atatürk's Turkey is a very, very clear example of exactly what was attempted to be done in India, right? In the sense that Atatürk's view of what a Turk should be, and which he managed to implement because he was in charge of the country, was so different from the average Turk's view of where the country is. And even after 100 years, that has just about changed now. Like that, even after 100 years, what was probably his most iconic act has been undone. Now the other thing is, can we predict what would happen 100 years from now in Istanbul? I don't know. Turks might change, and Turks, of course, have had much more higher economic development than India. It's a much more richer country today. It may not be a first as rich as European or American countries, but it's a very much more prosperous society. But still, these things matter in Turkey. So where will India be in 50, 60 years? Whether, is what Vivek said, whether people will look at other issues like Kashi, Mathura, or anything else, that's an open question. And that's where I think some of these issues of where India is as a state will sort of open up, and we would not be able to really be clear on that till we are sort of done with it. I would think that I think this Place of Worship Act is a very interesting thing to talk about, because the Babri Masjid very approvingly quotes this act. So to start with, I don't think any challenge to it is going to succeed in a court. But I'm quite intrigued to think that even if at some point there's a parliamentary majority to repeal this act, it's even possible a court might say you can't repeal it. That it's part of the basic, like repealing it would be against the basic structure of the constitution. So I think these conceptions of India are still in a lot of ferment, and people have drastically different conceptions of India today, and that's going to be a conflict that's going to play out for many years, or I think decades to come. I think that's probably the same even in Turkey. And these are two civilizations that clearly had people who were setting it on a different path from where the people, at least at that point of time, were ready to go. Let's see how that plays out.
Yeah, I mean, so to me, these kind of issues just highlight the dichotomy between a culture which is many thousands of years old, as some of us believe, or rather, which is the truth, and a republic of 70 years, right? There's a huge dichotomy between those thought processes as such, and it gets highlighted every time this kind of an issue comes up. The other thing is also, I think, the average person will understand why political expediency in cultural matters is so important, right? And also why it is important for people to sort of invest in political activism to ensure their way of life is preserved as such, right? So, all right, that brings us to the end of a fascinating episode. We've covered a whole range of issues associated with Ayodhya and Ram Janmabhoomi. So we hope this leaves you with a better appreciation for the events to come. And yeah, this podcast will be available on all popular platforms. Until next time, stay safe, take care, and Jai Hind.